How did working people around the world survive COVID-19? When the pandemic hit their countries, what were their working conditions and wages like? What plans do governments and international organizations have for post COVID 19 economic recovery? Do those plans really benefit working people? Join the conversation in this series on Workers of the World After COVID 19, brought to you by the Law Development and Conflicts Research Group at the University of Westminster. Welcome to this conversation, Atul and Gautam. We are very pleased to have you here, and Law Development and Conflict Research Group is very keen to hear your views today. Atul, if we can start with you, I was wondering, can you say something about how the pandemic impacted upon workers in different sectors in India when the pandemic broke out?
Thank you, Radha, for asking me to come and speak. It's an important area to sort of to understand and talk about. Let me say at the outset that the distress of the pandemic on the working people is now not only well documented but visible around us. So it's something that you can, it's part of people's experience on a day-to-day basis today. And it's also true that when the pandemic came and the response came in terms of the lockdown and the consequences of the pandemic on the working people, what happened to labor was seen on the television screens and in real life experienced by people, not only in India, but all over the world. And one of the things that one thought when that was happening, what one saw was that in a way, when we responded to the pandemic, when the pandemic came and the sudden lockdown within hours that we announced, what it resulted in was that it made labor invisible by force, because the right to find the most sort of humiliating, unprotected, exploitative work, which is the nature of the labor market in India, was taken away in a split second at the time of the first lockdown. And the second part of that experience was that because of the horror of and indignity of hunger, the labor also experienced was disgraced. 9 out of 10 workers in India experienced hunger, and the evidence is very clear. So there was callous and cruel. The second part of the disgrace was that there were, the workers themselves were blamed for this callous, for the experience that they were going through, and there was a callous and cruel blaming of the migrants for not being grateful to the state and for not listening to the state or not following the protocol of the strict lockdown. Where, in fact, as I will come to in details in a minute, where what kind of hunger and starvation that they were experiencing, and the reality of India's labor was not kept in the background as the measures to respond to the pandemic were announced. Now, if you strictly restricting myself in this segment on looking at the impact on labor, the Center for Sustainable Employment at the Azim Premji University has put out a compilation of surveys in which the workers on workers during this period, both in the first lockdown and in the second phase of the pandemic, and this is a continuing process. And what these surveys suggest is that 66% of the surveyed workers lost their job. 77% of the household were consuming less food than before, and 64% were earning less than before. CMI has come up with great number of details in terms of what has happened to the work itself. Out of 87 million salaried jobs in existence earlier, 21 million, or nearly 25%, had been lost during the lockdown. The worst affected have been the white-collar professionals, such as engineers, physicians, etc., who together lost 6 million jobs, CMI estimates. And in addition, 26% of industrial workers became unemployed during the lockdown. A good measure of what the pandemic did to the labor market can be assessed from some of the recent surveys that have come. So in a sense, they're capturing what happened in the last, roughly 2 years. And we have the most recent one is the one for the month of November. And if you look at the labor force participation rate, which is basically the labor which finds work as a proportion of people who are in the working age population, what we find is that there is a um, um, decline in the labor force participation rate over time. And in fact, if you look at the two pandemic shocks, overall there is an agreement in India that there is a lowering down of the labor force participation rate structurally. So it's more long term. And the declining trend has continued to bring it at lower levels. India's labor force participation rate, which was close to 40% compared to about 43% before the pandemic. And India's labor force participation rate is much lower than global levels. According to a World Bank estimate, which is a modeling exercise that they do, for the world, they estimated a labor force participation rate about 58.6%. The same model for India projects to be 46%. So you can see that implicitly most other countries have much higher labor force participation rate than the world average. And only 17 countries are actually worse in terms of labor force participation rate compared to India. And most of these countries are Middle Eastern countries. These are countries like Jordan, Yemen, Iran, Iraq, etc., which are going through a process of strife or a civil strife during this period. The second aspect of the November data that we get is also sort of giving us a hint in terms of the structural change in the in the trends of employment data. And only a quick point about that employment in urban areas is falling at a faster pace than in the rural areas. And there are great number of details. There, just a simple point that in November 21, while India generated 1.4 million additional jobs, its urban regions saw an employment fall of 0.9 million. And this was compensated by a 2.3 million increase in rural jobs. And I will come to this a bit later in terms of how the pandemic and this period of pandemic has actually strengthened the overall trend that was happening in India in 2018-19 or 1920, where the dependence on for labor to survive on the agriculture sector or on the rural sector is immensely increasing. And we are now seeing that process because of the precarity and vulnerability of work that is available in the urban areas. And the last point about what the November survey tells us is the fall in salaried jobs and fall in the count of entrepreneurs. And both are very significant points, because if you look at the thrust of policy, again, we'll talk about it later, there's the thrust of the policy is on self-employment, which is essentially meaning, trying to make people entrepreneurs and thinking of white collar jobs, and salaried jobs fell by 6.8 billion. Entrepreneurs fell by 3.5 billion. So there are great detail of numbers that are available around us, but one can clearly see that the impact of pandemic is not only in terms of that, a large percentage of people lost jobs and are thrown out of the labor market, but there's been a structural shift in the labor market in terms of how the labor market is going to be constructed in the future.
Thank you for that overview, Atul. If I can come to you now, Gautam, how did the pandemic impact upon trade unions? And if you can say something about your own work as a trade unionist during that period.
Well, I mean, when you have a statistic that 77% of the working population sort of had less to eat than they had the day before, nothing can be more stark than how that affects trade unions. I mean, you can see that virtually all our membership, except a minuscule number in high manufacturing and high services, highly unionized, very well protected. Apart from them, every one of our members across the length and breadth of the country, across every possible sector, really took a hit, and that's putting it mildly, was hurt severely, both in terms of access to food, access to health, and access to information about what the future held for them. So opening up a period of untold and unknown uncertainty. Uh, it's difficult, in fact, to recollect the early days of the draconian lockdown as it was enforced, rather with the power of police than as a healthcare crisis. Of just being helpless, of not being able to answer questions of members. Of course, I think the first problem was being able to reach out, get together. I think we were relatively lucky as an organization with a very large number of young members who were able to lift the spirit of the organization, bring us together digitally. So I think we were able to respond better and more quickly in retrospect than we realize. If I sort of think about the lockdown was called about the 24th of March, and by the middle of April, our national leadership had already met digitally. We were responding to membership needs. We were also responding to the question of payment of wages, over which there was and continues to be a great degree of uncertainty. You know, the fact is there was a government order that no employer should stop paying wages and no employer should fire a worker through the pendency of the lockdown. Of course, that not just did not happen. Big employers challenged government orders in court. And you know, it's still hanging fire given how the balance of force works out between the executive and the judiciary, really opening way for another and allowing you know, major policy decisions to get away. So I think it's difficult to say, apart from the fact that it was an absolutely awful time. I do look back in retrospect that we did pull together, we did hold together, we were able to stand up for our membership, we were able to get the message across, and I think today we are still there, we are where we were. Without doubt, our membership has lost jobs in some sectors, but I would say by and large, the Progressive Trade Union and our organization in particular has come out very strongly. Our membership has grown. The fact that we were able to stand up for our membership meant that more people flocked to us. And I think there's a sense that if you're part of an organization, you've a better chance of protecting your interests. I think that's a message that's certainly gone across the country. Today we're larger and stronger than we were 18 months ago, which I think is a big you know, is an important message to send across. But yes, I mean, I think the harshness and the absolute abuse and the lack of dignity in which the working class was treated is sort of, you know, almost now etched into public policy. And when Atul talks about reshaping the labor market, I think it's in a way already reshaped. A chunk of it's been, you know, there's been for a long time, there's been sort of a sense that workers are just dependent, they're destitute, they're good for nothing, they don't contribute to economic activity. And in a way, the government has succeeded in doing what it wanted to do by packing a whole lot of workers back into the countryside. I wouldn't say that they've become dependent on agriculture. They've actually just become dependent on the state. They've become dependent on the Rural Employment Guarantee Program. They've become dependent on food through the public distribution system. And in fact, they stretch the question of what agriculture is. They make numbers of agriculture by pushing such a large number back into the countryside. On paper, agriculture looks like it's a terribly unproductive sector. The fact is, in reality, it's not an unproductive sector. It's just that 60% of the population is living off 10% of GDP. And when you have that situation, then anything looks unproductive and unprofitable. You have more families trying to live off a tiny homestead. You have more families trying to eke out an existence out of nothing. And it is going to be a terribly, not just miserable, but also in economic terms, unproductive existence. So it's really sort of, the shrinking of the labor force and trying to squeeze as much as possible out of the few that they would like to keep within the cities. So it's really, that's really how I would see what the pandemic and the lockdown has done.
Gautam, can I just ask if you can say a little bit about how your work changed as a trade unionist during the pandemic? Was it the same as the organizing work that you did before? How did it change? Were there new challenges for you to take on during the pandemic?
It changed dramatically. We couldn't leave our house. Trade unionists typically don't come back home. When my daughter was little, she would say, "Baba comes home to wash his clothes." She saw me often as just using the house in a utilitarian way. Here I was locked up inside the house. I couldn't leave my house. If I stepped out into the street, I was asked what I was doing on the street. This is the point about a lockdown being enforced by a police state, as opposed to, and I'd repeat that, as opposed to dealing with the lockdown because of a healthcare crisis. So yes, we were working from home or walking to the office if we could, but really working from indoors. I think most trade unionists travel 4 or 5 days a week. We're out in the picket line, we're out in meetings, we're addressing meetings of workers. We're meeting with employers, we're going to courts. All of that really just got shut out. So we had to transform our work into really working digitally. I really pay tribute to and salute my comrades who were out there on the front line. They broke the law. They went out wherever they were to protect members, to stand up with members when members were being fired, when members were being laid off, not being paid their wages. I think they are the ones who did the most remarkable job to strengthen our membership. Those of us who were caught in the inner cities, in the center of metropolitan cities, really couldn't move because we were in the vortex of the police state, so to speak. I think there are several really strong and important soldiers from within the movement who were out there, come whatever barrier, crop tape, addressing every challenge to go out to stand up with membership. And yes, I think we were there. We were there for the initial weeks really digitally until we could get out our houses to get our office back on its feet, get it up and running. But if I can sort of put the whole thing in perspective, yes, it changed the physical nature of work, but it actually didn't change the involvement. It made the involvement and engagement much more intensive. When you're traveling, there's this much and nothing you can do. When you're on a train or an aircraft, you have poor connectivity or no connectivity at all. Here you were available 24/7. And you really worked 24/7 to do what it took. I might briefly say that wherever there was, I think we witnessed solidarity across borders in a way we haven't really witnessed over and that was important, and that really made our days 24-hour days. We were working across time zones, talking to colleagues during their working days. So yes, I think we in some bizarre ways got more out of the 24 hours than we ever have, but it was difficult, and I think at the bottom of it is the fact that our membership out there suffered, and that suffering continues. That suffering, in fact, for many gets worse.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Gautam. If I can turn to you, Atul, now. You touched on how certain structural aspects that were already there were exacerbated during the pandemic. Can you talk us through what the labor market scenario was before the pandemic, and maybe touch on how those pre-existing situations played out during the pandemic? How were they exacerbated, etc.?
I'm glad, rather, you asked that question because it has been bothering my mind that the quantum of information and the details we know about India's labor market and the condition of labor in India. It was on this canvas, so to say, that the response to the pandemic was imposed. So we knew that this is how our people and we live, and this is how our working conditions are, and it is on that we imposed the lockdown, and then we experienced the consequences that we discussed in the previous section. And you are absolutely right that the overall, though I did underline in the previous section that there are certain shifts happening in terms of the structure of the labor market, but overall, yes, the thrust that existed before, it is that one which has the extrapolation of, and the increase in the consequences or the direction of change that was already occurring. Now, if you were to look at the labor market conditions in India just around the time when COVID came, I'm sure you would remember also that there has been a lot of debate in India about the labor market statistics, and certain surveys being now continuing, not continuing, newer surveys, and the issues of coverage, etc. I would not go into that technical debate, but sort of put together the story as I gather from these different sources, fully being aware of the in the measurement issues that are embedded in this debate. If you were to look at the labor market before, I would sort of say that between 2011 and 2017-18, there was a particular direction of change in the labor market, or what was happening in the labor market. And between 17-18 and 19-20, which is when the pandemic hits us, there was a bit of a shift that was happening. And so, just to keep things simple, it will be useful, as I see it, to sort of divide in our observations and looking at these two segments, saying what was happening between 18 and 20, which was different from 11 to 17, and how that would matter then in terms of what the pandemic would do. Keeping that sort of qualifying comments in mind, it's well-known fact that the majority of the workforce in India was precariously employed as unpaid family labor, or as casual labor with no stability of income, or as regular workers with limited social security. So that's the sort of the landscape of India's labor market, which is unpaid family labor, casual labor with no stability of income, and regular workers with limited social security. Interestingly, employment in agriculture was one of the key sources that helped restore the declining work participation rates in the period between 11 and 17 in comparison to what happened between 18 and 20. It's also worth underlining that over the last decade, that is in the decade of 2010 to 2020, roughly speaking, no major compositional shift has occurred for the workforce in urban India in terms of engagement in different sectors, that is manufacturing, construction, trade, services, which are the common activities in the urban areas. No major compositional shift has occurred in this decade. And this is, the much talked about economic reform, and, the India leading from the front in the service sector, and so on and so forth. Total share of employment in manufacturing all over India has been, in fact, declining over the last decade. And it stood at about 11% in 2019 and 20. Within urban areas, which is where most of the manufacturing is expected to happen, it declined from 23% in 2011 to 21% in 2019. Even though it's a 2% decline, but nonetheless, it tells us the direction of change. Agriculture is known to be a sector which is informal, but outside agriculture also, Informality is one of the dominant and defining features of India's labor market, and one can say even India's economy. Informal employment, both in the informal sector and informal employment in the formal sector, that is workers in the formal sector who do not get the benefits of a regular worker or a formal sector worker. If you were to put all of these together, what we get is that in these informal workers, this informal employment rather, was roughly around 84% of the total non-farm employment in 2019-20. So just remember that when we announced the lockdown, since we are talking about the non-farm sector, agriculture was, neither the lockdown was implemented the same way, neither the pandemic had reached rural India the same way. The non-farm sector, 84% of the workers has informal employment. I include both the informal sector worker as well as the formal sector worker with limited social security. So that's the reason that the high percentages that we experienced, that within 24 or 48 hours of the lockdown, 3/4 of the workforce was experiencing shortage of food. So you can see that the precarity of employment that existed just before COVID hit us was there to was telling us a story of what we'll experience in the next 48 hours. In fact, if one were to sort of, generalize the period of the time period just before the COVID in terms of the labor market trends, I would say this was a period of, that is the decade of 2010, 2011 to 2020. This would be a period of job loss growth, not jobless, but job loss growth. So you had growth at the same time we were losing jobs, and most of this burden of job loss was faced by the socially and economically vulnerable social groups in India. A rising unemployment rate, decline in labor force participation rates, expectedly have adversely affected even the wages in the rural economy. So, at one level, we were pushing the labor, or we were trying to survive in terms of maintaining a labor force participation rate by participation in the rural market or in the agriculture market. But the rural wages were declining, and we have evidence of how, and that's the point that, I think Gautam was mentioning, that, when we talk about this rural and agriculture, it's also the survival through NREGA and through other social security schemes. So the dependence on agriculture in terms of underemployment might be visible in the numbers, but that that survival in the rural India is happening through various other mechanisms that he was referring to. The COVID and the pandemic has worsened these processes, as you were mentioning. So it will be important to know, which we don't have numbers right now, what would it have done to the already the low and declining rural wages. That's something that is to be discerned. So at one level, we have increased the dependence on rural India, but at another level, the economic viability and the earnings from there are going to be very low, and perhaps will compel people to have a very precarious existence. Now, with that kind of features of the labor market and the impact of the COVID, we have to also then see what possibilities it opens up for this labor. And the mobility of labor is immensely impacted. And so getting out of this the conditions of work that have been created by the pandemic, or that had been actually increased by the pandemic, which existed before the pandemic, has to be then seen in terms of what options it leaves for the labor to find the appropriate survival strategies. So I'm afraid I would have to say that as I discussed in the previous section, the recent numbers are suggesting that the precarious employment that I described for the decade of the 2000, that precarity might be increasing as we look at what is happening now.
Thank you, Atul. Thank you for that. That is, interesting. What struck me in in what you said, Atul, is you were saying that there is a reverse trend of urban labor now migrating to rural areas and putting pressure on rural areas. Now, in the post-independence period, one of the most important strategies, if you like, development strategies, was urbanization and modernization, and to push people out of agriculture into the urban labor markets. And so how do you see this reversal of trend? How should we understand it?
You're absolutely spot on. I mean, in fact, this leads us to sort of actually examine what is the strategy towards labor in general without breaking the labor market into rural and urban components, and how labor is being seen in terms of the approach of policy. And I'm not talking about specific policy measures here, but rather in terms of, conceptually how labor is being looked at. I mean, to me, what needs to be underlined is that the attempt seems to me, if one were to see it in terms of, linking it with the farm laws, that there is an overall process to create, the footloose labor, to increase this large chunk of footloose labor from all sides. And once you create this footloose labor, superimpose on it the regulatory framework, which is a framework of taking away labor rights, etc. And we'll elaborate on this if time permits later on. You build a relationship of patronage with this labor force, which is now footloose, which is very precarious, which will find work in few days in a year. You build a relationship of patronage with this labor force in every context, but particularly in the rural context. So, what one sees here is that two things. One, the way the growth slowdown and the challenges of growth are being mended. This mending, as a result, as a consequence of pandemic, is being done fully at the cost of labor. So this pandemic as a disaster has in fact created an opportunity in a way whereby this relationship of the state with the labor, or of capital with the labor, is going through a churning process of or the process of modification. And this, opening up this scope for what I just said, of moving away from entitlements based on rights to basically doles and benefits based on patronage. Large number of schemes have been announced in terms of food and direct benefit transfers, post-pandemic, which is good because people need to survive. And if you look at the coverage of these schemes and the numbers that we are getting, one can get a sense of the extent of precarity of work and low income levels for a large number of workers. But interestingly, a large number of people or households, but when the discussion takes place that 80% of the population is availing benefits or a food PDS or a special PDS scheme that is being currently in place, there is no discussion to suggest that what is it that compelling large chunk, 80% of population of a particular region, to depend on food transfers or food vouchers, which is being delivered as a dole. There is no discussion about the quality of work, the quantum of work, the precarity of work, which is compelling large number of people to avail these benefits. So the connect with the labor market in terms of this entitlement is cut. The entitlement is created as citizens, but that entitlement of citizens also sort of structure around patronage rather than rights of the citizens. And I just wanted to take 1.5 or 2 minutes here that this is actually very consistent with the approach that the World Development Report 2019 came into. World Development Report is actually a report which acknowledges the informality that is the developing countries are experiencing, and it suggests that the developing countries will now produce only precarious work, informal work. And so the kind of benefits that the increase in trade and the participation of developing countries in the global trade had happened in the decade of 90s and some years in 2000, that experience is not going to be repeated now by the developing countries. So now developing countries have to re-strategize itself of how they look at their labor. And there they say that let's not look at them as labor, but look at them as, we do not protect their jobs. We protect them in terms of their food requirements and other benefits as citizens. So protect the poor, but do not protect the labor. And that seems to be the thrust of Indian government as well. And that's why there's so much focus on, we haven't done it on universal basic income and so on and so forth. The World Development Report also makes another interesting point, which is linked with what is happening in India, and it says that the plan of relocating, and this is something that you underline, labor from villages to cities has to be relooked at, because the nature of jobs that are going to be produced in the cities are of a different order. And this is something that was said in 2019. So it talks about that the traditional provisions of social protection based on wage employment, clear definitions of employer and employee, fixed point retirement benefits, etc., are likely to become obsolete. And that's exactly what we are seeing in the labor regulatory framework that we are seeing. So what I'm suggesting is that there was already a thinking about reworking the relationship of the labor with state and with capital, and pandemic has just provided an added opportunity to implement it, because as you know, both the farm laws and codes, labor codes in India have been introduced in the Indian Parliament without discussion. Now the farm laws have been withdrawn, but there was no deliberation and discussion around them. So they were thrust from the top, and the pandemic provided the context to do that.
Thank you for that, Atul. If I can now turn to you, Gautam. I think picking up from where Atul just left off, he mentioned the three labor codes and the farm laws. If you can just clarify for us what these labor codes are about, and what is the problem with them, and what is the link to the farm laws. So Gautam, just turning to that, and how have trade unions responded, not just your union, but the unions in India generally, how have they responded to the labor codes, to the farm laws, and to the situation that Atul has described, where workers are moved from rights-based, organized working people into dole and patronage, that dependence on that. So how have unions responded to that?
I mean, before I get to what, you want me to turn to, I think the framework of moving from workers' rights to patronage is a trajectory that's been unfolding since 1991 in a very direct sort of way, folding through what one might call the period of neoliberal policy. There was a very short window in this long journey of depriving the working class of its rights, the short window between 2004 and perhaps, if one stretches it, 2014, where India came in public policy terms perhaps closest in its history ever, independent India's history ever, to a social democratic moment or a welfare state moment. That's really stretching it, but of translating social security and social protection into legislatively protected benefits, which made them guaranteed and inviolate, not something that could be handed out from one government to another, not one that could be played off at an election, etc., etc. There's a second underlying element, and I think that sort of something I imagine Atul and I are in agreement on, that there's a profound economic crisis in this country, a crisis that predates the coronavirus, which has really meant that development in the economic growth in the neoliberal period has meant extraordinary expansion of inequality, as a result of which there is a decline in demand, demand for common goods and services, which then makes the economy rather dependent on luxury consumption, so to speak. And the number of people who can consume luxuries, even by stretching it, is about what is a luxury is really about 10% or 15% of the population at best. So what we have, in fact, is an economic system that is not able to expand demand amongst people for basic goods and services, which would be the engine of growth for an expanding and growing economy, which in turn makes a unsustainable fiscal situation of being unable to collect taxes, unable to pay for welfare benefits. The entire sort of cyclical sort of system just breaks down. What's stood out in the period, especially after 2014, is the complete collapse of investment in this economy. And very importantly, the complete collapse of private investment. So this is an economic system that said the private sector will drive the economy. The private sector will be the engine of growth. And what you have is actually the private sector saying it's not worth investing in this economy. What COVID has meant actually is we have a profit-led growth. And to put that in very simple language, it means that on lower revenues, the corporate sector is earning higher profits. That for every rupee that they sold before March of 2020, if they made 10 paisa of profit today, they're probably making 15 paisa. Or better still, for 95 paisa of sales, they're making 15 paisa of profit. So this is actually what is the crisis. It's an economy that cannot create jobs. It's an economy that refuses to pay a decent, fair wage. And hence, it's an economy that has today to drive people away from the cities back into the countryside. What do you do with them in the countryside? Agriculture cannot sustain 60–70% of this population. And so the government treasury has to bankroll them at the lowest possible cost. So therefore, through food supplies and through employment at really below minimum wages through the employment guarantee program, that is actually bankrupting the fisc. So you have a fisc that's bankrupt, you have a private sector that refuses to invest, but earning profits hand over fist, growing richer by the day, 5% of the population growing richer and the rest growing poorer. This is a profound economic crisis. It's an unsustainable situation of one of the largest economies in the world actually heading to a kind of crisis that will open up political wounds I think no one has answers for. And in a sense, we're living in the really on the edge of it. In a way, what's been there on the table, so to speak, through these now 30 plus years of neoliberalism is reforming labor law, of making labor markets flexible. And it's almost a bit like, labor is what's holding, organized labor is what's holding the great Indian economic revolution back. But it's also had its own trajectory. Labor is indeed a constituency. The working class is heard and has spoken. And really all the way from 1991 to 2014, there was no significant change in law. But of course, what we saw is a complete erosion in the implementation of law. And where the legislature and even the executive were not willing to really change anything, in bits and pieces, the judiciary stood up against organized labor, especially enforcing and paving the way for employment of contract labor over permanent labor. In a sense, what's been tried to, or what's been pushed through Parliament in the 4 labor codes is, at the face of it, they say they've just simplified them, they've codified, 4,000 labor laws. They've done more than codify them. They've thrown up jurisdictional problems, they have thrown up problems of limitation. Very critically, what they have done, and I'll really say there are 3 things that have been done. which is importantly, they've enormously weakened the right to freedom of association, the right to form trade unions. They have effectively taken away the right to collective bargaining. They have thrown the minimum wage in doubt by coming up with a floor wage which would be lower than the minimum wage. And finally, they've significantly weakened legal controls on health and safety in the workplace, which all of these, if you think about it, would add up to cheapening the cost of labor, cheapening the cost of production and delivery of services, really, and help raise profits further. What's being done significantly is an attack on rights. And I think I would set that apart, even though it happened actually in the same 48 hours with the farm laws. The attack on the working class is an attack on working class rights. I would like to take a moment to remember that 95 years ago, unions in this country under British imperialism fought lengthy strikes, took on financial burden, took on expense, took on claims in civil suits to advance workers' rights to strike, to advance the right to unionism, a law that was won in 1926, all of 21 years before Indian independence, a right we've had not for 70 years, but a right we've enjoyed for 95 years. That's a right that's been taken away. That said, what is being sought to be done with the farm laws is to queer the pitch. And in part, these are WTO obligations. In part, Indian corporates have grown large enough to believe that they can meddle quite significantly in agriculture and make high profits. But really to open the farming sector to large corporate private investment, to contract farming, and to importantly do away with local agricultural produce markets which are regulated by government. Now, the existing system, nobody would argue was in any way perfect. But what's being put in place is actually a system of capture, of corporate capture. So I think the outcome would be to create more destitution, more footloose labor, and really, of course, this impact would not be uniform across the country. It would importantly affect the surplus grain growing parts of the country, which are really where the agricultural wealth of this country is concentrated in. One could argue that there are big farmers who ought not to be defended. Perhaps there are some big farmers who ought not to be defended, certainly not by a strong working class movement. But there are also middle peasants, there are also small peasants, there's also agricultural labor dependent on it, all of which would get gorged out of this and pushed into the large pool of the unemployed and increasingly underemployed labor force once they're taken off the land. So this would really be about throwing the baby with the bathwater. Agricultural reform needs to be addressed, but this is not the answer. So I think what we did, it's perhaps a government that's sort of rather carried away by its political arrogance and its self-belief, that it bunched it all together. There's little doubt that the farmers, especially from the three surplus wheat growing areas, contiguous as they are, socially, politically, culturally connected, were able to galvanize themselves and surround Delhi after a fashion, stop the government from pushing them back, stand up for their rights. But they've had the support of the country's working class, all the country's progressive trade unions behind them, very large section of public support, uh, uh, which is all very important. I think it's certainly symbolically a very, very powerful movement, something that's really brought this government to its knees. Not that it would easily admit that it's that a far-right government that believes that it's going to change the shape of this society is not about to admit that it's been brought to its knees. But to some extent, the rapid progress of implementing the new labor codes has been halted, at least partly for this, partly for the sporadic but rather sustained resistance that's come from unions across the country, progressive unions who've all acted in unison. We go on general strike on the 23rd and 24th of February, early in the new year. So there is a resistance. What that means is the labor codes actually are not in place. They've been legislated, they've been signed on by the president, but the rules haven't been brought in. Labor is an issue that's to be legislated jointly by both the union government and the state governments. Many state governments not ruled by the BJP are certainly going to stall. They're visibly stalling. They haven't even drafted rules, which they've put them out for comment. So there is a process of stalling, and so no one in government is actually the government in Delhi is speaking up openly, but clearly civil servants are speaking behind the scenes about delays, about no need for haste. Just to spell out what the labor codes are, the government legislated literally at a few hours' notice, not allowing any debate in Parliament in September 2020, using the opportunity of the pandemic of a Parliament that was meeting physically distanced, partly virtually, in the heat of having hammered through the farm laws the previous day, suspended some MPs, legislated the 4 labor codes, which are the code on industrial relations, the code on wages, the code on health and safety, and the code on social security. Without sort of going on about what happened in Parliament, they actually got MPs to vote on all 4 codes in one vote. So you have MPs effectively voting on 4 important pieces of legislation, which include the repealing of 44 existing legislation. So you're actually voting on 48 pieces of legislation, all in one vote, like, say yes or no. Because they've managed to get a bunch of the opposition MPs out of Parliament. They know they have a majority, and this is really what they did. Now, what these codes actually seek to do is, in one breath, transfer whatever rights workers enjoy. And let's be very clear about one thing. In a capitalist economy, whatever workers have won, they've won within a capitalist framework. These are not socialist laws. These are not pro-worker laws. They are merely rights that have been hard fought and won within the existing framework of capitalism, which have in one stroke been taken away and carte blanche handed over to capital to do what it wants. This is a bit like, Thatcherism on steroids. This is what Reagan and Thatcher were able to do in the Anglo-American world in the early 1980s. And I think this is an important point, a turning point in the sort of life of the Indian democracy as we see it, of really one side taking control and getting what it wants 100%, saying we don't care about what happens to workers. Workers are just there to ensure that factories run and services are delivered. Their lives don't matter. The quality of their lives don't matter. The next generation doesn't matter. And this was being done as factories were reopening with extraordinarily high rates of accident after the lockdown. I mean, let's not even get into what Atul said about hunger, about non-wage payment. But the sheer number of fatalities that happened in the months of July, August, and September as these laws were being put in place, as factories reopened after the lockdown, employers hurriedly restarting factories without adequate safety precaution, without adequate maintenance, without adequate testing, without ensuring that skilled workers were in place. Countless workers lost their lives. Scores were injured. Is just a reflection of symbolizing how disposable workers are today in today's India, in the India of the BJP. This is definitely unambiguously a shift in the character of our democracy, the quality of our democracy, and the balance of force, literally, in the democracy, that the majority of people no longer matter. It's the small minority of the rich and their political party, their government, whether that rich represents local corporates or multinationals, is quite immaterial. But that is the agenda going forward.
Thank you for that. If I can come back to you, Atul. Atul, you mentioned something about footloose workers and footloose labor force, and how you see that kind of playing out in the future, and the future of workers, if you like. So if you can clarify for us, what are the Indian government's plans for workers in the post-COVID economic recovery? You have touched on it, but if you can just amplify that a little.
Before I come to the post-COVID sort of policy approach, I just wanted to add to what Gautam has said on the codes, on the labor regulatory framework. Just adding, and I absolutely agree with everything that he has said, and the points that I'm adding are just adding in the same direction as he has highlighted. One, I wanted to say that I want to explain why the government did not want any debate in the parliament, apart from the pandemic and the opportunity. And I think there are three dimensions to that. One is that it did not want what you are doing right now, which is that the labor codes need not be scrutinized in the context of the conditions of labor market conditions that prevailed in India, so that the connect between the propositions in terms of the codes and the labor reality, that scrutiny is not done. That was one objective that was clearly achieved. The second was that if you were to discuss it in the parliament, then, as Gautam said, this is not the first time. So there is a whole documentation and history of regulatory changes in labor, including the various national commissions that have been put in place by governments at different points of time, including the National Commission for Unorganized Enterprises, the reports of, and so on and so forth. So the linkage of these modifications with the history of legislative discussion and the recommendations of the Parliamentary Standing Committee, because these codes actually moved away even from the recommendations of the Parliamentary Standing Committee, that scrutiny would not be required if you were to push it the way you pushed it. And the third, I think, is that the claims that are being made that these labor legislative changes will make in terms of improving the conditions of labor, in terms of the future, that scrutiny does not happen. So, the claim that it will help investment, the claim that will increase income, all that scrutiny could be avoided if you would thrust these laws the way they were thrusted on us, on the country. So I think there was this immense, deep reasoning and substantial benefits in terms of the modalities that were chosen to adopt these laws. So that's my the point about the modality. Now, in terms of what they did, I think there is one aspect of what were the essence of these and what the impact they will have. There are two different aspects, and if you look at the essence of it, what I think what it does. If you look at the Industrial Relations Code, the government will now minimize its regulatory role and reduce its responsibility for oversight. If you look at the Occupational Safety Code, it dilutes the duties of the employer, is ambiguous in terms of defining standards. What is a safety standard? And it sublets, it transfers the regulatory responsibility to third parties. That's very significant. So it's under the name of either a private or voluntary or whatever it passes. The third, if you look at the Code of Social Security, the institutional framework remains fragmentary, and the code shifts, and this is very significant, the onus of financing of social security schemes from the government to a mix of public and private resources. This is very significant. So this is what the essence of these three codes are. And what it does in terms of its implication are three quick points. It deregulates policy, it disempowers labor, and it dilutes standards. These are the three things it does. So the claims made, are quite contrary. So these codes are, they are very open-ended and broad. The way the codes have been presented, and they give powers to the government to come up with details via rules much later. So that's one issue that is there. Second, if you look at the nature of changes in compliance and enforcement and resolution of disputes, I think it's very important to underline these three in terms of the changes in compliance, enforcement of rules, and resolution of disputes. We get an insight of how labor is being systematically disempowered. Now, if you were to look at, the deals are also presented on an assumption that no previous information was available on the conditions of labor. And this is very significant because, on the whole debate on migrant labor, the government took an official stand in the Supreme Court of India when there was some public interest litigation there on what was happening to the migrant labor, that we do not have information on migrant labor. And so that formal position was now sort of implemented in which the legislative framework was proposed, as if we were starting from a clean state. So, Interstate Migrant Workers Act and everything else that we had and the documentation we had no meaning. And finally, the whole claim about simplification. Even that simplification is not there. If I had the time to, go into the details, the whole issue of threshold that has been, in terms of enterprises, the Occupational Safety Code applying to what level of establishments, 10 or 20 workers or 10 and above workers, all those complexities remain. So none of the claims are reinforced. The outcomes are not guaranteed because, our labor cost in India compared to China, and I've done some work on this to say that, our labor costs are lower. So the purpose of these codes is not to bring down the cost of labor. We are already lower. The cost of labor is higher. The fact that investment is not coming to India in comparison to what it is going to other regions, the explanation does not lie in terms of labor costs. So the premise is wrong and the outcome is not going to be what had been claimed. And that's the point, that you wanted me to comment upon. And therefore, what outcomes will it achieve? How the trajectory of labor would unfold. And I would say that, there are two sides to it. If you look at, and Gautam has powerfully elaborated on what happened to the farm laws and the so on. So I'm not here comparing the conditions and the issues around the farm laws and the labor codes, because the condition of labor in the industrial sector are distinctly different, as we have elaborated in last 45 minutes or so. And therefore, the struggles of labor would be of a different order than the resistance that has been provided by the small marginal rich farmers. But at the same time, I think it is the resistance which has the potential in terms of where the labor, the trajectory will unfold. And that's very significant, because I think that there is an overall sense emerging from what is happening and this onslaught from different directions, that the overall attempt is to disempower labor. The overall attempt is to create this footloose labor, large sections of labor, which can be picked, used as and when required, wherever it is required. I mean, one small point, we had it in some of our discussions before, that, post-COVID, the mobility of labor is now regulated in terms of what facilities are available for labor to use in transport move from one place to another. And there is now an increasing dependence of labor for migrant labor on the contractual, contractors supported transportation facilities, because public transport is not available of the kind that was available. What was restarted post COVID were not these ordinary buses and the transportation facilities that could be afforded by the labor. So there is an increasing dependence of the labor on contractors, which basically means that they can be brought together at one point of time and at convenience sent back via the contractor by the employer. And the possibilities of greater contractor employment is already created through the codes and the overall thrust of the changes in the economy. So so I think this empowerment is happening through multiple channels here. And I think this experience of labor, where in a sense it is feeling that it is imprisoned somewhere, and it is at the mercy of whatever the state and the employer, and the experience that it had during the COVID. All of this, I think, is going to make a huge difference in terms of whatever response or the collective resistance as it unfolds. It's hard to predict of the direction and the formation of that, but I think it is that resistance and the reaction to this experience of the last 2 years, which will decide the future trajectory. As far as the state is concerned and the capital is concerned, I think the trajectory is obvious. The trajectory is to create a large reserve army of unemployed or precariously employed, which is footloose and which can be dictated terms at convenience. And at the same time, because we are, at the, something which at the time where there's a talk about the fourth industrial revolution and the automation and the AI and all of that. So at one level, invest in the necessary infrastructure and skills, so to substitute labor of the kind that is available here. And we have this, the whole thrust on linking up education with skills far more intensely than before under the new education policy. So that attempt at the level of the state is being done to move and integrate a linkage between the labor market and industry on a very, very sort of incremental basis, rather than looking at issues of labor and seeing labor as rights and citizens with rights. So that's the direction in which the state is going. But I think I put my hope on the resistance of the labor in order to overcome these challenges and perhaps construct a better world for themselves and for all of us as well.
Thank you, Atul, for that very clear kind of, direction of travel, if you like. Now, coming back to you, Gautam, I mean, Atul put his faith on the possibilities of resistance, which is coming in from so many different directions. Could you just talk us through the challenges for Indian workers, trade unions, in building that resistance or in challenging the direction of travel?
I almost thought, Atul sort of set it out and ended it very nicely, and I almost was tempted to say let's close here. If that was quite inspiring. The resistance of labor is not going to be something that we're necessarily going to see in 1, 2, or 3 actions. Indian labor is a creature of Indian society. The Indian working class is stratified. The Indian working people are divided by multiple layers of, if I can call it, pre-capitalist social discrimination. I mean, I think one thing that we must recognize is capitalism plays most effectively in pre-capitalist social arrangements, and it uses it very effectively to its ends. What it's done world over for 2 centuries is employ patriarchy to discriminate against women. It's not just about discriminating against women, it's actually about creating a reservoir of relatively insecure, cheaper labor, so to speak, in relative. In a society like ours, of course, this has happened as a result of colonialism and immigration in many Western societies as well. We are divided by race, by caste, by religion, by region, by language, and of course by gender. And these divisions are what are employed, so to speak, by capital to sustain a divided workforce, ensuring that irregular labor is actually from the discriminated castes, communities, and religion, as opposed to regular labor that comes from historically privileged communities, so on and so forth. So we may not actually see a single action that will be earth-shattering or changing. But I think we are at every point witnessing protest. I would not, although I believe it's the responsibility of the trade union to transform spontaneity into sustained organizations, which then can carry forward determined struggles against capital. We are seeing growing spontaneous protest, many of which fizzle out, but actually are a reflection of an anger within the working class. Of course, you will see organized protest coming from the trade union in terms of countrywide days of action, countrywide protest, countrywide resistance. That we're going to see. We're going to see more of that as we're going to see localized action, spontaneous action. I think trade unions have a role to play in the localized action and the spontaneous action, to be able to guide it, to be able to pull workers into unions, to use those as moments to strengthen the union movement and build union power. I think all this will add up. I think we are beginning to recognize the weight of it. I understand that at times there's a lot of despair that you don't see something that's a countrywide action that's truly huge, that's truly country stopping. I think that's what we would look for. As a friend and comrade, sometimes at important junctures at the end of a public meeting, Atul has turned to me and said, "Look, what's happening over here? Don't you think you need to see a stronger resistance?" I think it's important for scholars of our movement to keep pushing us too. There's also sections within the working class that are, I think, today very restless about the lack of unity. There's a lot of younger workers who are in the unions who want to see much more unity, who don't see what these divisions are about, who are fighting them and resisting them. I think they have a very important role to play, as do women workers have a very important role to play in bridging the gap, the divisions that exist. The Indian working class movement had an enormous historical advantage. And that historical advantage was that the working class movement was born out of the movement for self-determination, out of the movement for independence, which really was what resulted in the politicization of the working class, in building a very conscious working class. That also formed the basis of a very widespread left and progressive movement in this country, which remains very deep at the level of mass organizations. I think the challenge today is to regenerate that consciousness, and in particular to regenerate that consciousness towards a new social contract, a social contract of equality and social justice, a contract of a renewal of the republic in the spirit of its constitutional values, but also looking at where the limits of the constitution lay, where we didn't go far enough, and which in a way has opened the way for what led to the rise of the new right, and then the domination of the new right, of bigotry, of authoritarianism, of division within society. I think this is an important role the working class must play, and I see it playing that role. I'm always reminded of E.P. Thompson's epigram that the working class is the class that is both made and makes itself. And it's perhaps the one class, and still, even though there are many naysayers, it's the one class that actually has an interest that goes beyond its own class. It's the one class whose interest stretches across society and for all classes and for all people. And I think we need to strengthen that role. We need to, as trade unions, return to that role in some measure. And I think that's where the energy for the movement will come from.
Thank you, Gautam, and thank you, Atul, very much for this very lively and interesting conversation today. And we will, I'm sure our listeners will learn a lot from what you had to say. And thank you very much again.